Right, thanks. Okay, thanks everyone for joining this AIMOS webinar. And in case you don't already know, AIMOS is the Association for Interdisciplinary Meta-Research and Open Science. And our 4th annual conference will be at the end of November, 28th to the 30th of November in Melbourne, Australia, and also online. So my name is Fiona Fidler, and I'm chairing this session on careers in meta-research, where we'll hear from 4 speakers tonight about whether having such a career is feasible, whether it's a sensible thing to do, and how to go about it if you nevertheless decide that it is for you. Our panel today is diverse in terms of disciplines and career stages. And in order, we will hear from Tracey Weissgerber, sorry, I should have checked that pronunciation, sorry Tracey, Tom Hardwick, Emily Sena, and Marcus Munafò. And I'm going to keep my intros of speakers short because part of these short talks that our speakers are going to give will be sort of autobiographical, so you'll learn more about them when they speak. But first up, we have Tracey. Tracey's a meta-researcher and a group leader at Quest, at the Quest Centre. So Quest is Quality, Ethics, Open Science and Translation at the Berlin Institute of Health. And Tracey's group develops automated screening tools that are designed to improve data visualizations, analysis, transparency and reproducibility in scientific publications. So Tracey, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And your pronunciation was excellent. I have heard all of the pronunciations by this point, so. Okay, so hopefully everyone else should be able to see my slides now. So the question that I was asked to address when I was invited to speak on this panel is meta-research a viable career option, or is it possible to have a career in meta-research? And this is a question that I ask myself daily. So I will share some ideas that I have with you, but I'm also interested to hear what our other panelists have to say. I think it's important to start out by just acknowledging some limitations. So I'm going to share my perspective based on my experiences, primarily in the biomedical science field. However, others' perspectives may be quite different depending on the field that they're coming from, or the time that they started, or the country that they're based in. So my interest in meta-research actually came from the work that I was doing as a physiologist and an obstetrics researcher. So I'm not actually trained originally in meta-science. My graduate work was all in physiology, and I was focused on the pregnancy complication preeclampsia, which is a leading cause of death for moms and babies. And one of the things that was a major problem in the field at the time was that we recognized that while women get to a similar set of symptoms in the end, they get there in very different ways. So there are maternal pathophysiologies, there are fetal pathophysiologies, and there are placental pathophysiologies. And in any given woman, we may be seeing a combination of those different things, as well as different pathways within each of those 3 maternal, fetal, and placental categories. And so there was a lot of emphasis in the field at the time on identifying subgroups of women who had particular pathophysiology so that we could match pathophysiologies to treatment and potentially have more success. The problem with that was that most researchers were still presenting continuous data in bar graphs. And this is an issue because if we're looking at subgroups of patients, we expect any biomarker or pathophysiological process to be perfectly normal in some women with preeclampsia and very abnormal in others, depending on their pathophysiology. And all of that information is concealed when we present our data in a bar graph. A bar graph is what we use when we want to mask heterogeneity. When we want to understand it, we need to use more informative ways of visualizing that show the data distribution. And so I started my first meta-science paper after sitting in a conference in a preeclampsia session with a colleague, and we were watching all of these bar graphs go by, and both of us were really frustrated. And so on my way home from Italy in the airport, I started downloading papers and just looking at how many of them had bar graphs in order to understand how common this problem was and the context was in which it was occurring. And that led to our first meta-research paper. So this was published in PLOS Biology in 2015. It was viewed more than 100,000 times in the first month that it was published, and it subsequently went on to change policies for a number of different journals, including PLOS Biology, as well as many others. And one of the things I'll note here about the challenges of being a meta-scientist is when we went to publish this, the journals that we talked to would not publish it as a meta-research article. So we had one journal that said, well, we would take it, but only if you remove the data. And we had another journal that said, well, and in fact, PLOS Biology said they would publish it, but as a perspectives, and we could present the data in the supplemental files, which is what we ultimately did. So what have I learned about the viability of meta-research as a career option? The first thing is I think we have to consider carefully what we mean by a career. And for a lot of people who are early in their careers or starting their PhD, perhaps working on a postdoc, I think that often means an academic faculty position. And so I think we need to start by recognizing that obtaining a faculty position is very, very challenging. But if you are a meta-scientist, there are additional challenges. One of those challenges is that it is difficult to get training. So in my case, when I started, I didn't know that I was doing meta-science, and I didn't really realize that until several papers in. And there was no one that I could really go to get more training and experience in how to do meta-science or what meta-science was, or how to do meta-science well. I was fortunate to have a colleague who was an expert in systematic reviews, as well as the opportunity to take a very good practical hands-on course during my time at Mayo, which gave me some crucial skills for meta-research, but certainly not everything that I needed. So I think getting training in the early stages is a particular challenge for people. The other thing to consider is who is ultimately going to hire you once you have your meta-research training. So if I was in physiology, most institutions have a department for physiology. However, when you're in meta-science, there are very few meta-science centers, and they are scattered all over the world. And so, thinking strategically about, is it going to be possible to get a position at one of those few places? Am I in a field where I can combine meta-science with my regular science? And for me, I was not in a field where that was really an option. The other thing to remember is that in our current system, scientists are generally judged based on publications and funding. And these are criteria that are particularly challenging for meta-scientists. The number of journals that handle meta-research articles is very, very limited. And if you're going to a journal that's outside of that, very often you'll be told that they do not publish these types of papers, that they would be out of scope. And even if they're willing to consider it, they may not have an appropriate network of meta-scientists to send it out to review your paper. And so the publication process is, I would say, much more challenging and much more labor intensive and time consuming compared to my experiences publishing in other fields that I work where there are dedicated journals. I think it's also important to recognize here that meta-science generally does not have its own dedicated journal. And for me, it's really important to publish the science that I do in journals that normal scientists read, because that's my audience. And so working with journals to have meta-science collections, I think, is very important. And then the last thing is finding funding opportunities is very challenging. Again, there are a lot of agencies that don't consider the meta-science work to be within the scope of what they will fund, which then impacts your ability to be evaluated positively compared to your peers in other fields. I think this panel is a great start to discussing what a career in meta-research might look like, but I think as you're listening to the discussion today, it's really important to consider survival bias. And so everyone here is pursuing a more academic career route. There are people who have left science because they didn't feel that meta-science was an option for them and a viable career option, and that's what they wanted to do. There are also people who have started companies because they didn't feel that they could achieve what they wanted to achieve in improving research culture and practice through an academic science position. So if we look at, for example, people like Gary McDowell, who runs a company to help organizations integrate early career researchers into their advisory boards and editorial boards, or if we look at people like Lenny Tatelman at Protocols.io, who set up a protocol repository, these are people who have started science adjacent companies because they wanted to be able to improve science in a different way. And then there are also an increasing number of institutions that are starting open science offices or science improvement offices to help researchers at their center conduct better science. So I think it's important to think broadly about what a career in meta research and science improvement might look like and where one might start that career. What can the scientific community do to make meta science a viable career path or a more viable career path? I think there are two things that are critical here. One is that in order to create space for meta research, we need champions within funding agencies, within institutions, within journals, and within societies that recognize the value of meta science and are willing to advocate for resources to be devoted for meta sciences, for positions, for funding, for meta research collections and journals and other things to level the playing field for meta researchers compared to other scientists. And then I think we also need to reward and incentivize work to improve research culture and practice. So we held a virtual brainstorming event a year and a half ago, and we just have a consensus statement on recommendations for helping early career researchers to improve research culture and practice. We had 54 early career researchers that were heavily involved in founding, leading, and running initiatives to improve research culture and practice from around the world. And all of them said that their number one obstacle was that their work to improve science was not rewarded and incentivized within the academic system. And if we continue in this fashion, then the people who are doing that work are going to be progressively pushed out of science. So advice for aspiring meta scientists, as I've mentioned, I think it's important to consider a wide spectrum of career options in scientific improvement and not just faculty positions, and to think creatively about what you have to offer and how you can offer that. I think it's important to seek out training and support from meta scientists who are doing rigorous and interesting work. So as I said, in my case, this was a real challenge for me because I didn't necessarily have access to anyone who was a meta scientist, and she could help me develop my skills and navigate a career path. And I think the meta scientist community needs to be better about identifying and connecting people with other meta scientists because it is often very spread out with only one or two people per field. And then the last thing is I think education and communication skills are critical. So every meta research paper or project has to have an education component to it. We're not here to publish papers. We're here to change and improve research culture and practice. And we can't do that if we're not disseminating our work in a positive way, and in a way that resonates with the researchers and the members of the scientific community we want to reach. And so I've just put a QR code here that links to a training that I give on the way that we develop the communication and dissemination strategy for our first paper. And that's an approach that we've since refined and continue to use for subsequent papers. So that is all I have to share. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm interested to hear what our next set of speakers have to say.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to checking out those education resources. It's interesting, this topic of looking for careers outside of academia came up in our first session too. And I hope it comes up again at the discussion at the end of these talks as well. So on that, do type questions for the Q&A and discussion that will be coming up at the end of these talks. Do type them in the chat at any time and we'll get to them at the end of our speakers. So thanks, Tracey. Our next speaker is Tom Hardwick, who's a Marie Curie Research Fellow in the Department of Psychology at the University of Amsterdam. And Tom's work involves empirical assessments, often quite laborious, intensive empirical assessments of bias and reproducibility in the published literature. And he's interested in tools and guidelines to help improve research transparency and to mitigate error. So, Tom?
Great. Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Matt, as well, for organising this. Let me just bring up my slides. Hopefully that's working. Yeah. So as you can see, I spent a bit of time procrastinating on my first slide because this question kind of provoked a bit of an existential crisis. As with Tracey, I kind of think about this a lot, and I think it's an important issue. So I thought I'd just start by describing my own career path, so you can get an idea of where I'm coming from. I started my PhD in experimental psychology in 2012. So this was really at the dawn of the crisis of confidence in psychology. And long story short, I had lots of negative experiences during my PhD that really kind of challenged my naive and idealistic view of the way that science should work. So by the end of it, I was pretty disillusioned, and I was fortunate to discover meta research, and I ended up getting a postdoc position at the meta research. I think someone's got their mic on, yeah, so I got a postdoc position at Metrics, and I was there for a couple of years before moving to the Quest group in Berlin, where Tracey is based, where I did a postdoc for a year. I then got stuck in New Zealand for a few months, bizarrely, at the beginning of the pandemic when they closed the borders. I'm not going to get much sympathy for that, I'm sure. That's probably one of the best places to be stranded in the middle of a pandemic. And eventually, though, I came back to Europe, and for the last 2 years, I've been doing my third postdoc in meta research, this time at the psychology department at the University of Amsterdam. And in September, I'm going to be moving to the University of Melbourne, where Fiona is based, to do another postdoc in meta research for 2 years with Samin Vazir. So as you can see, I'm very much trying to have a career in meta research. And so I have a few thoughts to share on this question of are careers in meta research viable? And an important general caveat to everything I'm going to say here is that it's not evidence-based. It's beyond my own personal experiences and impressions. So as far as I'm aware, we don't have any good systematic data on how many people are actually doing meta research, how many want to do it, how many have tried and have left, etc. I think Tracey pointed this out as well. So it's difficult to kind of give a strong answer to this question. So please bear that in mind and take everything I say as being pretty tentative. So I think to try and answer a question like this, oh, sorry, see, I'm not sharing my, hopefully you can see my slides. I think an important question is, how are we even defining meta research? And I think the AIMOS logo actually does a really good job of capturing this kind of intersection of multiple different disciplines. I like to think of meta research kind of as an umbrella covering lots of different activities related to research on research. And within that umbrella, for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to sketch out a few very rough kind of caricatures of different types of meta researchers, because I think the way we answer this question depends on what kind of meta researcher we're talking about. So we have these folks that are often called methodologists, and they've been around for a very long time. There are historical examples, Paul Meehl in psychology, Jacob Cohen, Edward Lima in economics, Douglas Altman in medicine, for example. They've been doing what I would call meta research for a very long time, and their colleagues for a very long time. But I think that they're very kind of typically working within a single discipline and generally focused on development of methods with an element of studying how those methods are used in practice. Closely related to the methodologist is the synthesizer. These are folks who are doing systematic reviews and meta-analyses, again, typically within an individual domain. And then we have the meta-researcher who doesn't know they're a meta-researcher. I couldn't think of a shorter name for this person. But these are folks who are working in long-established disciplines like philosophy of science, science and technology studies, scientometrics, and they've been doing what I would call meta-research for a long time. The important difference here is that they've been working in an established discipline. And finally, we have what I'll call the new wave meta-researcher. And these folks have sprung out of somewhere during the last decade or so, typically inspired by the crisis of confidence, which has happened across many different disciplines. And I think they're quite different to these three other types, as I'll explain. So in a paper a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I tried to sketch out a kind of framework to point out the salient features of this new wave of meta-research. And there's no clear delineations here, but these are, I think, some important salient characteristics. I think this new wave of meta-research is much more interdisciplinary than those other types. It has a very empirical focus, and it's also got this translational element to it. So as well as identifying problems, investigating them systematically, we're also trying to develop solutions to those problems and then evaluate how those solutions turn out in practice to kind of create a feedback loop. So if we think about what the ingredients are for having a viable career in meta-research, I think the answer is different depending on these different types of caricature. And for the methodologist, the synthesizer, and the meta-researcher who doesn't know they're a meta-researcher, they already have a kind of established infrastructure in place. So they have faculty level job opportunities, they have more dedicated funding streams, established communities and journals to publish in. Relative to that, these new wave meta-researchers do not have so many direct funding schemes to apply to. Tracey pointed out the problem with journals. There are some good communities like AIMOS to join. The most important factor, I think that the main thing I want to convey here is the jobs issue. In recent years, we've seen the growth of early career research positions for this new wave of meta-researchers. I'm an example of this with my serial postdocs, but also the first PhD students who are doing their PhD in meta-research. The problem is we don't have the next layer. We don't have faculty level positions dedicated to these new wave meta-researchers. So there's a gap at the top of that career trajectory. So with that in mind, I have a few kind of pragmatic tips to share, particularly with early career meta-researchers, which may be helpful. The first is to try and stay anchored in some kind of home discipline. So I've tried, and I don't think I've done this very well and would do things differently next time in my next life, is to try and keep a foot in psychology in my case, as well as doing this kind of more interdisciplinary meta-research. That keeps your options open. I think it's also a good idea for the quality of your work if you're embedded within a home discipline to kind of understand what the challenges are on the ground. Twitter is a great place to find meta-research opportunities, jobs, resources, things like this, talks like this. You don't have to do your entire PhD in meta-research. You can just dip a toe. You can do one project on the side, collaborate on someone's project. Also learn to say no. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm in open science and meta-research communities, lots of projects you could get involved with. Try not to overburden yourself and also distract from your main PhD project. So as well as engaging with some of these things, also be careful about how many you get involved with. And as well, if you're getting involved with these large-scale collaborations, which I think is fantastic, also make sure you're balancing that with some projects that you're leading yourself. And also, a lot of meta-research, unfortunately, does lead to kind of spats, get into unprofessional discourse. I've had a lot of aggressive responses to data sharing requests, for example. And the important thing is to kind of try and develop a thick skin and rise above it and maintain your kind of professional composure when you're faced with unprofessional behavior on behalf of others. And find a community to help support you, like AIMOS and the reproducibility journal clubs are a fantastic way to meet like-minded individuals. So in summary, I think that currently, if you're a new wave meta researcher, then your career path really has an unknown destination in terms of faculty level positions. So it's probably wise to try and keep alternative paths open as much as possible within academia, also outside of academia. And you do develop a lot of generalizable skills like R programming and leading team projects and things like that. The most important thing, I think, the central message I want to convey here is that if we're going to be supporting early career researchers in doing meta research, we need to be thinking about the entire career trajectory. So how can we create faculty level positions? This is a little bit self-serving, I must admit. How can we create faculty level positions for upcoming folks who have trained solely in meta research? And that's all from me. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom. Again, these discussions about careers just all much more interesting than I expected them to be. I think particularly this idea of like staying anchored in your home discipline, that's something that I have heard come up in quite a few of these talks now. And whilst we're going to move on to the next speaker now, it's something that I hope gets picked up again in the Q&A at the end of these talks. On that, do remember to keep typing your questions for speakers in chat, and I'll try and sort through them for the discussion at the end. Okay, up next is Emily Sena. Emily is a senior lecturer in the Centre for Clinical Brain Sciences at the University of Edinburgh, and as some of you are no doubt aware, she's also the inaugural editor-in-chief of BMJ Open Science. Emily uses meta-research to drive improvements in validity, transparency, and reproducibility of primary research that uses laboratory models of human disease. Over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Fee. Hopefully I'm sharing now. I'm kind of relieved, actually, after Tracey and Tom's talks, that I think I have very similar thoughts that hopefully come across. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Emily Sena. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. So I've got a tenure track post and I've got a team of about 6 people. As Fee said, I'm a preclinical meta-research scientist. So I focus on the modelling of human diseases in the laboratory. Mainly in animal models, but also looking at cell-based models as well, but to ensure that they are useful and lead to improvements in human health. But also I'm a Black female academic that I think has challenges as well in terms of being an academic. In terms of whether it's possible to have a career in meta-research, I think yes, it is. But there's clearly challenges and caveats. I struggled a little bit to kind of disentangle issues related to just being an academic and having a successful academic career and those that are specific to meta-research. But I guess, you know, if we're thinking about an academic career, and that's what I focused on rather than the conversation we've had already about potentially other career options, then I think these challenges are pervasive as well, with the additional challenges of meta-research. So this is kind of my career timeline. I finished my PhD that was split between Melbourne and Edinburgh in 2010. I did a 1 year.
Emily, sorry to interrupt you. There's just like, can you move? I think there's a window across your slides, so we can't see the slides, the heading.
Is that
like,
better?
You know, that's it. Thank you. Sorry, keep going.
So yeah, this is my career timeline. So I'll just get this on. I did a 1 year postdoc in Edinburgh and then went back to doing a split postdoc between Edinburgh and Melbourne up until 2014. Became a research fellow up until 2018 and then started my tenure track post in 2018. Up until now, I'm a senior lecturer. And I think similar to others, my I didn't know that I was doing meta research when I started. So my PhD title was a systematic review meta-analysis of neuroprotective drugs and animal models of ischemic stroke. And I would describe myself as a neuroscientist. That was my kind of background. Using Tom's words, I guess I was a synthesizer and also a bit of a methodologist. And it's only as time has gone on that I identified myself as a meta-researcher. But I think that's also partly, especially in preclinical meta-research, this is, it's an emerging discipline. It's something that is evolving now rather than something that was necessarily established with a title. So in preparing this and reflecting back, I think my approach has been probably to tell you more of the things that I did wrong, and hindsight's 2020 and what I would do differently. And this kind of comes back again to what Tom was saying about learning to say no. And I think this is something that I really failed in my career. I was pathological in saying yes. And I think primarily it's kind of flattery. You're like, oh, wow, these people think I'm really smart and I'm really important. Of course, I'll do what you've asked me to do. And there was lots of peer review requests, speaker invitations, joining boards, committees. This is just some screenshots of different boards and groups that I'm part of, but also collaborating on lots of different projects, because as we all know, a lot of the techniques that we learn in meta research, whilst I was embedded in stroke research and in neuroscience, are applicable to lots of different disciplines. And I think the benefits of this is that, it allowed me to establish my independence. It was markers of esteem being asked to join these things. I was definitely challenged out of my comfort zone, which I think was important to confidence building. I got to do lots of travel that I really enjoyed. I had lots of outputs, and in our academic for assessment, I guess, having papers is one of the things that we're judged against. Demonstrating effective collaborations. I got to coordinate lots of projects, work with lots of different personalities, broadened my lot. There was lots of benefits to all this kind of, say, pathological yes saying, but I think lots of cost towards it. I was middle author for lots of papers, and I hate saying that, because I think that I'm a big fan of credit taxonomy, and I think every author has a role and a purpose in a paper, but the academic system that we exist in, being a middle author isn't something that is necessarily valued, which is why I put there, even though I disagree with that. I very much felt like I was a jack of all trades rather than master of any of them, and felt very frustrated, and I didn't really have control of what I was doing. And I think this comes back to Tom's point about being rooted in a discipline, because I was in all these different disciplines, and giving a meta research itself wasn't really seen as a discipline. I was giving all this advice and working with people, but wasn't really in control of anything. I didn't feel like I was in control of anything. I feel like I not wasted a huge amount of time, but spent a lot of time preparing for all these different things I was involved in, traveling to all these different places. I was always jet lagged. A Melbourne to Edinburgh commute is ridiculous. A lot of the work I was doing, I think, wasn't recognised as much as other work. And then I felt really guilty that I felt like I was doing lots of things and not really doing it very well. So why did I say yes to so many things? I think one of the major things for me was I didn't really understand the black box that was academic promotion. And I wanted to demonstrate willingness and commitment to things. I didn't want to affect my prospects, because it's such an uncharted career path. I wanted to be seen as a team player. I genuinely wanted to help. But I think I didn't really understand exactly what, I felt I have to get papers and I have to get grants and I have to do all this stuff, but I didn't really understand all the metrics. As Tracey mentioned, lots of funding, funders don't have dedicated streams to meta research. So there was lots of rejections. I did a screenshot from our university system, looking at bids that I've put in. These aren't all PI, some of these are co-Is as well, but 19 of them unsuccessful, 19 applications that's unsuccessful. And then you've got 7 in total here that are successful. I'm waiting for another one. But like I say, these aren't all big project grants. Some of these are small student, short £2,000 grants. The big ones, I think the weight of unsuccessful is much higher. So there's a huge amount of rejection that I think is probably worse in meta research. Definitely a fear of missing out. You don't want to say no to the thing that actually is going to make your career. So I kept saying yes to lots of stuff, scheduling people down. And then as a Black female academic, I felt like it was important to work harder to represent in different spaces. So the impact of this is that 24 hours in a day just weren't enough. And my inability to say no isn't just a work thing. I think this is just my personality exacerbates this. So there was a lot of stress. Like I said already, I felt like I was doing a lot and not very well. Imposter syndrome, not just as me as an academic, but also in meta research itself as a discipline. Didn't feel like I was there wasn't a meta research department. So I didn't feel like there was very much an imposter syndrome around meta research itself, and I think this definitely decreased my productivity. So what changed? I think feedback from others. I think there was a lot of "I don't understand how you do so much" kind of comments that made me reflect, saying, well, I'm not really doing all this stuff very well. I think this experience, apparently with age comes wisdom and confidence. I think better understanding of the system as well. So it's only when I applied for promotion, when I was going to apply for promotion, that I actually read the promotions form and had a look at exactly what was required. And if there's one take home from this, I would recommend that you look at the promotions form in your institution and have real clarity on what it is that is asked. Because I was actually surprised at some of the stuff that was considered as important on the promotions form compared to the general chat that people have. I think when I started my lectureship, I was enrolled in some leadership training, and that was, I think, very beneficial for me. I became very critical of the value of a specific activity. I became much better at using mentors, and they are senior meta researchers, few and far between. And I'd always had mentors, but I hadn't really used them, I think, in the way that I was beneficial for my career. And then time management, including a bit of self-care, I think was a big game changer. So where I am now, better at identifying a lot earlier when I'm doing too much. I think much more strategically about what I'm doing. When I say no to things, there's a reason. But also giving others opportunity, because I think building a critical mass in meta research is essential. The discipline needs to grow for us to sustain. So giving opportunities to more junior colleagues, I think, is incredibly important. Although I don't even want to start talking about my inbox, which is still completely unwieldy. So what has helped, as I said, mentorship, sponsorship, finding my tribe. I think meta research now is a discipline in its own right, and it's recognised as that much more so than it was. So some of the examples that Tom gave, things like reproducibility, finding a community is important. Cheerleaders, people who aren't meta researchers in other primary disciplines but are very supportive of meta research, I think has been incredibly beneficial. Compromising, learning my values, learning that things can be on my terms. It's not just yes or no, but doing things that I think are valuable for me, and also better at knowing my limits. So, people will always ask you to do things until you say no. So learning to say no when it fits you. So my final slide, in terms of reflections, is that there were far too many yeses. And I appreciate that those too many yeses have had clear long-term benefits, but with the benefit of hindsight, then, there would never have been so many. Things aren't black and white. So negotiation and control, prioritization is important. I think relationships and community are really key. So groups like AIMOS, I think, are fantastic. it's definitely time for me to resign from some boards and committees and sort out my inbox. And I think Tracey mentioned this survivorship bias. You know, we are a group of people who have managed to stay in the discipline. So I think it's important that we also think about those who haven't managed to, for whatever reason, stay in meta research and understand what the challenges were in those scenarios. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, and I'm glad that our invitation to you to speak at this event managed to make it through your inbox, and thank you for saying yes to this. Though, having said that, I totally, I felt a lot of that very personally, those things that you said about saying yes to too many things. And there's a lot that strikes home, very close to home for me in what you've said. And I think there's been a fair bit of talk so far about how grants and publishing is maybe harder in meta research, which is interesting to me. And I think it's kind of quite a sciencey, coming from science or from science perspective. I mean, if you come from like philosophy, meta research looks like it's raining money. But yeah, differences in perspective. Okay, so remember again, keep typing questions in the chat. I'm now going to introduce Marcus Manufo, who is now the Associate Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research Culture and, Research Culture and what, Marcus? At the University of Bristol. He's also a Professor of Biological Psychology, and Marcus has a long-standing interest in how incentive structures shape researcher behaviour and consequently research quality itself. And I think it's probably fair to say that he's particularly interested in how institutional structures shape researcher behaviour. Marcus is the chair of the UKRN Steering Committee, which, on top of its many achievements within the UK, has spawned an international network of RNs, including the Australian Reproducibility Network. Marcus, can you finish my sentence? Associate Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research Culture and
that's it. There's nothing else.
Oh, that's it. Oh, okay, good. All right, over to you.
Thanks. So what I'll talk about touches on a few of the things that have been raised. Tom's taxonomy is really helpful, and I want to again reiterate that point about survivor bias and the fact that I managed, through the kind of random walk that I'm going to describe, navigate the obstacle course of academia, albeit with a certain amount of privilege to help me on my way relative to many other people. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that much of what might count as success was down to a certain degree of luck, or at least timing. People who've heard me talk about bias in science before might have heard me talk about the kind of formative experience I had during my PhD when I tried to replicate a finding that looked absolutely nailed on in the academic literature, but I couldn't replicate. And that made me feel like I maybe wasn't cut out for a career in science, because if this finding was so robust, what was I doing wrong? And I was fortunate enough to meet an academic who said, oh, no, everyone knows that finding is really flaky. And that was quite an eye-opening experience for me. 20 years later, there's this review. I don't want to pick on the literature particularly. It's no better or worse than many others. But this point that the ways in which we measure some of these things are so unreliable that the findings that are generated are incredibly flaky was known 20 years before this, but not talked about openly. So in some respects, this article captures some of the progress that we've made over that period, from all of this stuff being unspoken and implicit, that one could only access if you happen to be in the right place at the right time, talking to the right person. Now there's much more openness about some of the problems in many of these literatures, but that was my starting point. I did my undergraduate training in experimental psychology, my PhD in health psychology. Then the random walk really started. My first postdoc was in public health and primary care. Then I went into clinical pharmacology, then into psychiatry, back to experimental psychology when I moved to Bristol to take up a lectureship, but I'm now part of an epidemiology unit. So although it's all in the biomedical and life sciences space, I've walked around a few different disciplines, and that's been good for me. Although it's not what one is typically advised to do if you want to sort of plow a furrow and become known for one thing. Actually, it's helped me learn a lot about what different disciplines do well, what they don't do so well, how we can synthesize some of those good things that are done across different disciplines. And one example of that is the fact that when I went into that public health and primary care department, I was working with people who were part of the Cochrane collaboration doing systematic reviews. And as Tom alluded to, Meta-research has been around for a long time as a career path in that particular sense. There are people who have careers as systematic reviewers. And the Cochrane collaboration, I think, is a good example of how you can go from something being quite niche to being an entire discipline and career path in a relatively short space of time. So the Cochrane collaboration was only really starting out when I started my postdoc. It hadn't been around for very long by that stage. Now, not only is the Cochrane collaboration an established thing, an entity, but there are career paths that has spawned that are not necessarily directly part of that. And you'll see adverts typically in medical schools and medical research departments for systematic reviewers to work on projects. And that there are people, there is a professor at Bristol, Julian Higgins, who is effectively a professor of systematic reviews. So those career paths do exist in a narrow sense. And we can look at examples like the Cochrane collaboration if we want to draw inspiration for how we can start to develop similar structures for other aspects of meta-research. But the point is that I then was able to take that systematic review methodology from the Cochrane collaboration, which at the time really focused quite narrowly on randomized clinical trials, and apply that to a very different literature, which was the candidate gene literature on associations between specific polymorphisms and behavioral traits. And that really was the point at which that little twinkle of interest in how factors might shape how science works beyond the cartoon version of how science is meant to work. So I'd had that failure to replicate experience. Then I started applying this methodology to this literature, which again, a casual reading of which would have suggested a degree of robustness that actually a systematic review indicated was not justified. And the data that I extracted through that process started to indicate really interesting patterns, like the fact that effect sizes declined over time. Earlier publications reported larger effect sizes than later publication, the so-called decline effect, that there was patterning by country. So lots of other factors were influencing the effect sizes reported by these ostensibly quite similar studies. And that really started my interest in meta-research and the factors that drive the quality of research. And it stemmed from that multidisciplinary approach, if you like, learning from one field, the systematic review field, the Cochrane collaboration, and applying it in a very different context. So that was when I started to get a bit cross about all this stuff. And I was banging on about candidate gene studies for years with everyone saying, oh no, but we're still getting grants and we're publishing papers, so let's not rock the boat too much. And you're basically being a bit annoying by critiquing all of this stuff in the way that Tom was alluding to. It's not necessarily a way to make lots of friends. And I think that's one of the things you need in academia generally, and I think perhaps particularly so in the context of meta-research, which has an explicitly critical angle to it, is just a bit of a thick skin, because you do have to rock the boat slightly if you want to make people pay attention to what you're saying. So that was when things started to culminate around opinion pieces, this manifesto for reproducible science, for example, that we wrote a few years ago now, just saying quite explicitly, these are what the problems are. And we've had quite a long period across a range of different elements of the biomedical space, if you like, describing what the problems are. Now we need to start thinking about solutions. And so in terms of where meta-research is going, I think we're at a really exciting point where we're moving beyond just the epidemiology of meta-research, if you like, to the intervention development stage. And we're starting to look at new ways of doing things and looking at whether or not they actually work as intended, whether they have any unintended consequences. And that, I think, is really interesting for us as a field, because we're going to now have to make sure we hold ourselves to the standards that we espouse. It can be very easy, I think, if you are particularly set on a particular intervention being the thing that will really help us improve the way in which we do science. It's very easy to then get locked into that narrative and to start to interpret evidence through that lens, which is exactly the kind of problem that we've been describing in the context of other literatures. So I think we're at an interesting tipping point ourselves as meta-researchers in terms of the need to retain that self-criticism and to act as critical friends to each other, so that we don't just become sucked into the same incentive structures that are so problematic more generally. So Fiona mentioned the UK Reproducibility Network. That was where we got to in terms of that attempt to bring together all of this grassroots energy, these early career and mid-career researchers who wanted to improve the way in which we do things and to evaluate how these different ways of working might actually have an impact on the quality of the research that we do, but also bringing together institutions, funders, publishers, and so on. And in the context of careers for meta-researchers, for us, this is a vehicle for trying to build some ladders, if you like, to allow people to progress through different stages of their career whilst retaining a certain amount of meta-research activity, whether that's their sole focus or, as it was in my case, a sideline for a good part of my career. And the good thing is that that's generating some success now. We are getting some substantial funding. Now, this investment here, which is very exciting for us, does include funding for positions, but those positions are on the professional services side. They're people running the open science programs within their universities, for example. And I think one of the interesting questions for academia generally, and for meta-researchers perhaps in particular, is whether those traditional distinctions between academic careers, professional services careers, technical careers, are really appropriate anymore, because actually the boundaries between them are now much more permeable, and there is much more overlap between the activities of meta-researchers, for example, and the activities of, let's say, data teams within library services. Much of what is funded by this project will fund professional services positions within library services, for example, but with an evaluation component that is meta-research of the impact of these open research practices, of the impact of introducing open research criteria in hiring and promotions processes, for example. So I think we need to also think flexibly about whether or not that traditional narrow linear academic career path is necessarily the most appropriate one, full stop, but also in particular the most appropriate one for meta-researchers, where there needs to be, I think, much more crosstalk between different elements of the systems in all directions. So within institutions, between researchers and people in library teams, for example, but also with funders, with publishers, and so on. So maybe there's a place for meta-research careers that allow people to move more freely between different elements of the system, working in funders, working with publishers, working in library teams, and so on. And the person that we've appointed to lead this program is perhaps an example of that. Neil Jacobs was previously at UK Research and Innovation, a major umbrella funder within the UK. Previously, he worked at JISC, which is a digital services provider for the higher education sector. Now he's working with us on this open research project, but he's going to be leading on writing papers, writing grants, evaluating the interventions that are part of this program of work. So he is effectively becoming a meta-researcher, bringing the experience that he's brought from those other elements of the academic ecosystem. So perhaps part of the solution to careers in meta-research is thinking more flexibly about what that might look like. But the good news is that in that narrower definition of meta-research as an academic career path, even then we're starting to see some investment to do the kind of meta-research activity that we're all interested in. These are examples of some of those funders in the UK that have funded us to do meta-research. For example, Wellcome has asked us to run a program of work looking at conceptions of research integrity across disciplines, across institutions, and across countries. And so I think there is an awareness amongst funders that this kind of work needs to be funded. The challenge is always that then has to come at the expense of something else that they might fund. So there's this kind of zero-sum element to it. I think the point about getting publishers to ensure that this kind of research has a home as well is also important. We've not struggled to find a home for our meta-research, but I think that's something that could be improved. So having spent a long time having to have meta-research as something that I did in the margins of my main career, if you like, it does feel like we're now at the point where there is much more support, awareness, support for and awareness of the need for this kind of activity. And as Emily was alluding to, there are now enough people who've managed to survive this far through the system to be in senior positions to hopefully try to help create the ladders that will allow other people to follow through so that we can retain that critical mass. Thanks.
Thanks, Marcus. That's a really interesting idea. I'm trying to think of like what a parallel term for interdisciplinary would be, when it includes not just different disciplines, but also those professional service roles as well. We haven't got quite as much time for discussion as what I might have led you to believe, but let me ask you all this question from Lizzie Lizzie Corval. If we could design our ideal future direction as meta-researchers, do we want to be our own discipline or faculty? What would be the pros or cons of separation from where we currently sit in our traditional disciplines? Feels like what Marcus has just talked about, not being able to integrate those professional service roles, might be one con. Anything else our speakers would like to add to that?
So I think having an ongoing and constant dialogue between researchers who are doing traditional research and meta-researchers is absolutely essential. If we aren't understanding the problems that people are having, understanding the ways that attitudes are evolving, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of solutions that are proposed, when they're working, when they're not, when they can't be implemented, and why, we are nowhere. And so one thing that I've been working with for a while is something I call the spoken hub model, where we want to bring researchers from traditional fields into Quest or into meta-research centers, meta-research spaces, to gain some understanding of what meta-research is, how it can help traditional scientists do better research, and then send them back into their communities to aid with dissemination and sharing what they've learned. And that also gives us a regular path of communication to help understand, what are the problems that they're having? How can we address them? How can we make solutions that are more effective, that are more robust, that are more useful and workable for people? And to develop it as a collaboration environment. So rather than a hard boundary between meta-research and traditional science, to have people in traditional science fields who have an understanding of meta-research, who are involved in meta-research projects, who have the capacity to say to us, hey, we want to do something on this, can you help us? Or this problem is really important, how can we solve that? And I think that for us has been a really valuable way of making sure that those borders are porous and that we're really interacting with the audience that we would want to support and impact. And
Marcus, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, it's perhaps a slightly tangential point, but one of the things that we say when we're talking about open science or open research with people who haven't yet adopted those practices is don't feel like you have to do everything at once. Just start with something that's an easy introduction to that way of working. And I think the same is true of meta research. So one can try to be a meta researcher where that's your primary focus, or you can just in your primary research area start to introduce elements of that in all of the work that you do. If you do a systematic review, you're doing meta research, but you can enhance that by then looking at things like, allegiance bias, or think the patterns of publication across time or across countries, all of the things that I talked about in the context of those candidate gene studies. You can bring in some of these different analytical approaches like multiverse analysis into the way in which you do your research. So have a reflective element, a meta research element to all of your primary research, and use that as a way of growing interest in that way of doing things within your particular discipline. So, for example, in physiotherapy, maybe there aren't people doing a huge amount of meta research. There will be people, I'm sure, doing systematic reviews. So just see what ways you can introduce some elements of meta research into your primary research and use that to grow the interest over time. And just recognize it takes patience. It does take time. And that's one of the frustrating things. I've spent years banging on about this stuff. And so you do have to have that persistence if you want to drive things forward. It won't necessarily happen quickly, but the way in can be quite a subtle one.
Tom, you talked about keeping a foot in your home discipline. Is this a vote against meta research becoming its own separate discipline?
Yeah, I have sort of conflicted views on this. I think what Tracey describes is kind of the ideal model where you have perhaps even the majority of the workforce doing meta research are embedded in their home discipline. And as Marcus says, mainly doing primary research and also doing additional meta research. But I still think you need a dedicated group of people just doing meta research to kind of man those hubs and to kind of coordinate and have that kind of broader understanding across disciplines. I think if we lose that, we'd go back to this model of having methodologists just working in their home discipline, and we'd lose this like fantastic interdisciplinary conversation that we're having and all this momentum behind, what can we do? How can we learn lessons from each other? You kind of need generalists and translators to work across communities as well as people working within communities as well, I think.
Emily, would you like the last word?
Oh, God. I don't know if I've got much more to add. I guess I don't think there's a one size fits all. And I think there'll be people who will I guess, will be cross-cutting across disciplines and will be more meta-researchers, and others who will sit within those disciplines. I think Tracey's point is really pertinent, that it's important to know your audience and establish relationships and connections with that audience to make sure that what you're doing is fit for purpose, is feasible and pragmatic, that it actually then leads to, you know, more reproducible, valuable science.
Oh, I'm really sorry that we've run out of time, because I feel like there's many more things we could have discussed with this wonderful group that we've assembled here, but unfortunately it's 7 o'clock here, and whatever time it is for you, wherever you are. But I want to thank you all for joining. This has been really fantastic, and I want to thank our speakers for their very thoughtful presentations and consideration of the question that we put to you about whether this is a feasible career move. I hope to see lots of you at the AIMOS conference later in the year too, but we hope maybe we can pick up some of these themes there. So thanks very much for joining us. See you again soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.